But good evening, I'm Erik Molano, Town Hall's Inside Out neighborhood resident for Capitol Hill and the Central District. On behalf of Town Hall, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's poetry reading, presentation, and panel discussion, Histories of Capitol Hill and What We'll Build Next. So as someone personally who moved here 5 years ago to work at Microsoft, I quickly realized the role that I played in Seattle's change and was really disturbed by it. I was making more money than I felt I deserved. I worked all week and partied all weekend here on Capitol Hill. So in 2012, gentrification was very visibly well underway, and I knew I was part of the problem. But it felt like by being here, I was pushing lifelong residents out and just consuming the neighborhood. I didn't add anything to it: art, music, queer events, community space, and definitely not housing. So after 5 years, I now co-run an art and community space in Georgetown called Photon Factory. And I realized space is really important. Land is important. And I feel like I'm finally giving something back to my community.
Johnny blood, I become troubled. I wonder, what nation is it that claims my pen hand as I impose these words on the page? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was beautiful. So our next poet is Anastasia Renee. And Anastasia is the civic poet of Seattle and former 2015 to 2017 poet in residence at the Hugo House. She is the author of Forget It, Answer Me, and 26. Her poetry, prose, and fiction have been published widely. Please help me welcome Anastasia.
I, too, was looking for the safety of the podium. Thank you for having me. I usually don't give a disclaimer before reading, but I want to say that many subjects of my work talks about the idea of privilege and ownership and not acknowledging a group of people or deciding to acknowledge a certain small part of a group of people. So I just wanted to give that disclaimer. I don't want to send you away thinking like, but hey, she didn't stick to the subject matter. I just love her so much. The women inhale coffee while Lululemon sweaters dangle like static in hair or participles while they dote and coo over Michelle Obama. And they must have said, classy and strong and classy and strong and classy and strong and classy and strong and witty and well-dressed. Oh, Michelle Obama, sitting next to me. And there I am, and they never even once say hi, hello, good morning, pass the sugar, never look my way, never, never, never. Michelle Obama's so classy and strong and classy and strong and witty and well-dressed, sitting next to me. Hi. Hello. They talk about Michelle Obama as if they're on a first-name basis, like Michelle Obama's going to roll on up to their neighborhood, like they're going to go shopping, and they say things like, what's it like to be Michelle Obama raising black girls in America? What if Obama wore a sweatshirt and came to our neighborhood? Michelle Obama is so classy and strong and witty and well-dressed, sitting next to me. Never even say hi, hello. Never even say good morning. Never even say pass the sugar. Never even say go to hell. Never even look my way. And I start to think maybe I'm not classy or strong or witty or well-dressed or Lululemon enough or raising black children in America. Maybe I'm just an everyday woman. And I'm not angry or jealous of Michelle Obama or Oprah Winfrey, but I've just come to realize I am not the kind of Black woman citizen who will ever hang on anyone's white wall with yellow thumbtacks. And a few city poems from Forget It. The city sits on itself like a tired Black woman after a long day of being Black. It never excuses itself for crushing us with her weight, and we don't complain. After all, we are alive, we are drinking, we are beautiful in the rain, because the rain makes us blurry, and when it does, we don't have to talk about the things we really want to talk about, like what is not working in the city. The city often asks us rhetorical questions like, are you happy? Do you belong here? Where is your Zen? We choose not to answer these questions because, we live in Seattle. We don't answer real questions, rather we change the subject. We are passive. We are aggressive. We choose not to talk about these things. We would rather talk about new food diets to try. We try these new food diets and they work and some don't work. We say things like, oh, cute shoes. Let's please get together for lunch. Are you happy? Do you belong here? Where is your Zen? The city wants to be Lucy crushing on Linus, wants to be sleepless in Seattle and me dreamied up. But we are, get out of here with all that love. We want a Valentine's Day unconditionally, but we don't know how to love. But we love on 5 conditions, plus 1 secret, plus he, she, plus we all want it to be perfect. Nice shoes. Yeah, I'd love to go to lunch. The city is not a community because we don't all speak the same language. We ask what your love language is as we turn and walk away.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. That's fantastic. And so our final reading tonight will be by Sarah Galvin. Sarah is the author of Ugly Time, The 3 Einsteins, and The Best Party of Our Lives. Contributor to The Guardian, Vice Magazine, The Stranger, and City Arts, and is also a human bottle rocket. She has an MFA in poetry from the University of Washington. Please welcome Sarah Galvin.
Hello. So, I grew up here, and when I was a kid, it was like New Jersey. People weren't passive-aggressive. When I'm aggressive, I'm just aggressive. And I hope that's reflected in my poetry. So here's my book, Ugly Time, put out by Grandma Press. And the first poem I'm going to read. First of all, I just like to say thanks to the other poets for reading tonight. I really enjoyed all of that, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you for having me. Let's have a round of applause for everybody. I'm very happy to be in this rich literary community which has survived all of the stuff that we're talking about. So this first poem is called I Heard She Was Fired from Catholic Arby's. But I looked all over that place and I couldn't find Arby anywhere. Maybe this is why I feel what I've heard is called malaise. I climbed every historic building in town, and nothing was on top of them. Now most of them have been demolished to make way for buildings that lack even the possibility of something on top of them. That lack is worse than disappointment. It's depleting my vitamin D. To someone with a vitamin deficiency, human genitalia is invisible. Nothing is more erotic than confirming by touch the existence of something you can't see, except when it's just what you expect. This one's called The Gutter on the House of My Life. Time is the gutter on the house of my life, draining away all my non-sexy memories. I thought I had one non-sexy memory of riding a speedboat between two yachts that were so close together they ripped the hull off the speedboat. But someone told me recently this actually happened to Indiana Jones. I was disappointed until I realized if I generate enough sexy memories to clog the gutter, I might become immortal. And I guess for me, that's what poetry is about. This one's called Liability Rubber. On a sherbet-colored fall day in Pratt Park, kids climb the jungle gym like the ants that colonized Jasmine's bra when she poured candy corn down her dress at a party. I heard a story on NPR about a guy who could orgasm from peeing in the sink. The plastic jungle gym is composed entirely of safety features. Its springy rubber substrate won't prepare children to fall on an adult sidewalk. We discourage kids from participating in reality. Dad banged on the door as his son came in the sink to pull him away from the freeway. That's the closest thing to a jungle gym in this town. This one's called I roll around wearing only a powdered wig until all the wounds are dry. I turn the daily practice of pulling old pieces of metal out of my skin in the shower into a popular dance called the Macarena. I adapted the hard wince and ensuing shudders into a twist followed by a dip. Deeming the rest of the dance's inspiration not fun enough to be a dance, the rest is mostly hand claps and ass maneuvers. The dance swept the nation. Though apparently there was already a dance called the Macarena. Now, after recycling the bits of metal each morning, I roll around the floor of my apartment, wearing only a powdered wig, yelling, "I'm George fucking Washington," until I don't care there is already one of those too. Let's see, two more? This is called Sound Hole. I have trouble connecting with people because while I look human, I have the perspective and emotions of a rubber band ukulele. Someone says, "I feel devastated," and I reply, "I emit amusing twanging sounds when the rubber bands stretched across my paper aperture vibrate." I could lie to help people relate, but the defining characteristic of rubber band ukuleles is honesty. Let's see. This one's called Pastaphilia. At a party in a century-old train car, we dance on the table, stepping in cake, knocking over glasses. Everyone present agrees this train car, which once belonged to FDR, is among the few beautiful things left in town. We thrash in its fringe of curtains, which resemble sheets of gold noodles, until the dust flies from them, yelling, "Pastaphilia," in fake Italian accents. And I wonder what it is about new snow that makes me run through it. Later, in our bed, I touch you everywhere, looking for the damage. I'm going to do one more. I'm just deciding which one to do. Okay. So as I mentioned, I grew up here. This is about the house where I grew up, which was in North Seattle and is now kind of abandoned or demolished or something. I don't know. It's called The Language of Come. The saddest thing I've ever learned is most people's come is a foreign language, retaining a fraction of its alien beauty, if you're lucky. By the time you've learned what it means, or worse, it is calculus. Like snow, every orgasm with my first love turned the house where I grew up into a new place, where nothing terrible had happened. But of course, the best thing about a new place is meeting new people. And wherever there's more than one person, something terrible happens. What I mean is, I'm not sad because of you. I just wish we could kiss somewhere that isn't melting. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yeah, I think hearing each of their readings reminded me why I was so excited to organize this event, and why Brad and I think feel like we hit some kind of a spark. Because yeah, tonight is really about saying, like, there are so many different ways to explore a neighborhood. It can be funny, it can be historical, it can be about building, it could be about creativity, innovation, imagining the future. And so the next part of our event, I'm going to introduce Alex Brennan, and I'm super honored to have him here. He is part of Capitol Hill Housing, and his approach is on development and land use. So he's a senior planner at Capitol Hill Housing, and since 1976, Capitol Hill Housing has worked alongside the community to build and preserve affordable housing, affordable to working families, and promote the qualities that make Seattle a vibrant and engaged city. So please welcome Alex Brennan. We're going to get the slideshow started. All right, and then we got sound for the video, just to make sure. All right. Is up here good?
Do I get to hide behind the podium?
Yes, you do, and you can click through here. Yeah, that's good.
Okay, this is going to take me forward, the right button?
Yeah.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me here. Thanks all you for being here. As Eric said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the projects that Capitol Hill Housing works on, and some of the sort of concrete ways to get engaged in shaping the future and sort of the trajectory of Capitol Hill. And I hope this isn't too dry after all of those wonderful poetry readings. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the organization I work at, Capitol Hill Housing, and then I'm going to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned from some of our recent projects, do a deep dive into a particular project, 12th Avenue Arts, and then talk about really quickly just a few of our other more projects that are coming up in the present or in the near future. So Capitol Hill Housing, the organization I work for, Eric mentioned that we were founded in 1976. I love this document from one of our early days because it gives you a sense of sort of the small grassroots organization that we were in 1976, working on combating disinvestment and redlining on the eastern part of Capitol Hill, originally called the Stevens Neighborhood Improvement Program. We had a lot of different types of programs early on in our days. We had a tool library. We had programs to teach people how to fix up their homes. We had a home sharing program where seniors could get some support in finding folks to rent out a spare bedroom in their home, help them be able to afford to stay there. And eventually, though, we started acquiring property. We were able to provide some affordable units. About 10 years after we were founded, we had about 100 affordable apartments that we were providing on Capitol Hill and throughout the city. And fast forward to today, and that affordable housing piece of our mission has really grown exponentially. We now have 48 buildings, primarily on Capitol Hill and in the central area, but you can see also in this map around the city that provide homes for 2,200 low-income people. And so as this really important affordable housing work grew and grew, we realized at some point that we had lost some of our connection to sort of the broader mission of being engaged with our neighborhood and working on sort of the broader issues facing our neighborhood. And so over the last 10 years, we've really been trying to figure out how to reconnect that to our work. And so that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. And a project that really helped get our thinking on that started was a project called 12th Avenue Arts. Just a show of hands, how many folks have been to a performance or been to a community meeting in this building? Okay, so about half the folks, that's great. Let me give you a little bit of the story about how 12th Avenue Arts came to be and sort of what it does now, what we've learned from it. So for many years, there was this surface parking lot at 12th and Pine that was for the police to park their personal cars. And we kept saying to the city, this is such a prime location. Couldn't we do something more with this space? And then in 2007, the Oddfellows building was bought and renovated. And after the building was renovated, the rents went way up, and basically every tenant in the building except for Century Ballroom had to leave. And this had really been a hub for the arts community in the neighborhood. There were a ton of arts organizations, different kinds of art spaces that were housed in Oddfellows. And so that really sort of spurred the arts community and us and the city to recognize how fragile the arts were on Capitol Hill. And so a year after, this group called the Cultural Overlay District Advisory Council was formed to start trying to figure out how do we make sure that things like this don't happen again, or that we can come up with other strategies to allow those organizations to stay close to each other, be able to work with each other, stay in this neighborhood. And that led to a lot of things, but one of the big things that it led to was that we were finally able to get the city to agree that maybe we could do something different on that surface parking lot, and that could be this vision for a building that included affordable housing, included performing arts spaces, and included office spaces for community organizations and arts organizations to be able to stay in the neighborhood. And so that building became 12th Avenue Arts. It was completed in 2014. Around the same time, the city also formalized this area as an arts district. It was the first formalized arts district in the city. And that was really based on the organizations that had come together to help us craft this vision for this project. And so you can see here on this map, there's a ton of arts organizations clustered in this neighborhood. Laura mentioned coming into this neighborhood for all of the different literary activities that happen here. We're really fortunate to have such a richness of art spaces and arts organizations, but they're really increasingly at risk of being displaced. And if you can see, I don't have a little pointer, but 12th Avenue Arts is an important anchor now for that community in a way that Oddfellows used to be. But the big difference is that provided the police department with parking underground, which is actually also an emergency response center. So if there's like a massive earthquake, 12th Avenue Arts is actually the safest place to be in the entire neighborhood. And that's where the emergency response will be sort of organized out of. And so these are the organizations that ended up coming forward to manage the theater spaces. So we were really lucky to have 3 local theater companies come together and manage those spaces. And then this is the residential portion. Again, 88 apartments, affordable to folks making 60% of area median income or below. So that's sort of like $38,000, $39,000 for a single person. And I included this slide this is the flow of how the money has to sort of come through the legal entities to make the building work. Just to point out that the federal government makes the creation and funding of affordable housing incredibly and unnecessarily complicated and difficult. But we're fortunate to have organizations like Capitol Hill Housing in our neighborhood that have the technical expertise to sort of make those projects work. So here are some pictures of the building. There's some great different outdoor spaces for residents to enjoy. Really nice interiors for the apartments. There's lots of fun performances and other things happening in the building. A couple different pictures of that. And then Erik had asked me to sort of tell a personal story about someone affected by the project. And we were fortunate enough to have Northwest Film Forum do a very short film with one of the residents in the building, who's a longtime Capitol Hill resident, who really loves going to the theater and was able to stay on Capitol Hill because of 12th Avenue Art. So I'm going to see if I can get this short little film to play. Oh, I think I did that wrong.
Look at more stuff's going up. May make for high property prices, but it doesn't make for a good community. You have to have a mix of people to make life really interesting and fun. I have been a resident of Capitol Hill for 40 years. And what I love to do are all the theaters, like lots of theaters. The most recent was the Stupid Fucking Birds. That actually was incredibly good. When I moved here, I was a young woman with a family and a career. We moved into a cooperative house, the Craig House, pretty famous place on the hill. I continued on living there for 40 years because I actually like living with people. My career here in Seattle pretty much was in the nonprofit world, teaching English generally. I said to myself, when I retire, I want to do the Peace Corps. So that's what I did and was sent to Columbia. But while I was in the Peace Corps, we had a fire at Prague House. You know, it was just bad, very traumatic. The prices of housing here on Capitol Hill had just skyrocketed. The change in this neighborhood was stunning, and there was no way I was going to be able to live in my community where I've lived for 40 years if I had not found Capitol Hill housing. They have a real commitment to maintaining affordable housing. My daughter is here, you know, my extended community is here. It's good to go out and find out about the rest of the world, because there's nothing like Capitol Hill.
So that's a little story about Nora. And then I'm just going to take a few more minutes to talk really quickly about a couple of the projects we have coming up, or that are kind of underway, I guess. So this some projects that are almost done that we'll be excited to talk about soon. So you may be wondering what's happening around the light rail station. There's been an over decade-long campaign to ensure that there be affordable housing at that station, to have there be community space, have there be a permanent home for the Capitol Hill Farmers Market. That is all finally going to be coming sort of to fruition soon. And Capitol Hill Housing is going to be building a big portion of the affordable housing in that project. And we should be breaking ground, I think, this summer. So I'm very excited about that. And this is one of the many community meetings that we had over the years where people had to show up to sort of make those requirements, make that project possible. So I think it's really a testament to the sort of power of community organizing and community pressure to influence big organizations like Sun Transit. There's also another project that we've been working, my coworker has been working a lot on recently, which is ensuring community benefits from the Washington State Convention Center. Washington State Convention Center is doubling in size. It's going to be the largest single real estate, most expensive single real estate project in Seattle history, just right across the freeway over here. And we've been part of a coalition called the Community Package Coalition that's been organizing to ensure community benefits, including $29 million for affordable housing, as well as improvements to parks and open space in the neighborhood and bicycle and pedestrian improvements. And the final votes by City Council to approve those benefits should be coming to a vote very soon. So there's opportunities to get engaged and support that. So those are some of the things that are wrapping up. And then we have a bunch of projects I'm really excited about that are just starting. One of the things that we're doing is to try to more explicitly address the displacement of the LGBTQ community from Capitol Hill. There's lots of LGBTQ folks who live in all of our buildings currently, and we work hard to make all of our buildings really affirming, welcoming places. But we wanted to have a project that really specifically was designed with programming and ground floor uses and branding to really be a place to anchor that community that's increasingly getting displaced from the neighborhood, and particularly to focus on seniors, many of whom have lived in this neighborhood for a really long time, have all of their services and connections here, and to have to move can be really traumatic. And also we've been hearing a lot that senior facilities are often homophobic, that a lot of people are having to go back into the closet in order to find care and find housing. So a parking lot that we own at 14th and Union, where we're planning to build that building, and while we will be able to do that, and are working with a lot of community partners to build momentum for that project that they could live in that was LGBTQ affirming. They also really wanted intergenerational community and connection. So one of the other things that I'm really excited about is we're in the very early stages of partnering with youth care, including housing for youth transitioning out of the youth care shelters. And so here's my contact information. If you would like to get involved in any of the things that I've been talking about, feel free to reach out to me. And I think also in your agenda, the agendas that you got when you came in, there's a little place to say if you're interested in connecting with any of the presenters today, and you can give your contact information, and then I will follow up with you. So looking forward to connecting with many of you in the future. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, so for those of you who got a program, you can just write in what you're interested about, tear it off, and you can leave it at the front desk. And for those who didn't get a program, you can, we'll put a paper up there so you can sign up. All right. Okay, so next up, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So the first panelist I'd like to introduce is Marianne Henderson. She is a high school teacher and historian, a queer Chicana woman. She's originally from South Texas. Growing up in the ever-militarized borderland of the US and Mexico had a profound effect on her development as teacher and scholar. Her research on Seattle focused on gender, class, and poor removal in the early 20th century. Some of her recent commentary is focused on policing in schools, and she teaches at the Northwest School on Capitol Hill. Please welcome Marianne Henderson. Next, I'd like to introduce Cynthia Brothers. Cynthia started the site Vanishing Seattle in 2016. Who here has heard of Vanishing Seattle? That to document the displaced and disappearing institutions, cultures, and communities of Seattle. She's a nonprofit and philanthropic consultant who's worked in the areas of immigrant rights, online organizing, and arts and culture. Cynthia is also a member of the Chinatown International District Coalition, Homebows Not Hotels, and has contributed to the Seattle Globalist. Please welcome Cynthia Brothers. And then I'd like to welcome back Anastasia Renee and Alex Brennan, who will be joining our panel too. Can sit a little closer. Awesome. Thank you all for being here. Really appreciate it. So the first question, as Nora mentioned in the video, she's lived on Capitol Hill for decades and still lives here and still wants to live here. So I was just really curious, why is Capitol Hill such a desired destination for so many old and new residents? Anybody can answer. Also, while you're out there, you can think of questions too, and we'll have an open discussion in about 30 minutes. Yeah, anything.
I think for me, it was a matter of just being practical. I'm doing so many things. It's a place that has public transportation. I can walk to everything. And I think I also thought about safety. Unfortunately, there are still some areas in the city that I cannot walk down the street with my wife having a really bad time. And so I think of Capitol Hill as used to think of Capitol Hill as one of the areas and neighborhoods that's pretty queer friendly. There's a lot of different kind of people here. This is my mindset for like, okay, you can settle up here for a while. So those are my original thoughts.
Cool, thanks. Anybody else?
I'll just add, I think, from one of the things that's sort of reflective of the history of Capitol Hill housing is that Capitol Hill, there was a time when a lot of people were leaving Capitol Hill, and there were a lot of empty buildings. It's hard to imagine in a lot of ways now, but in the 70s, Seattle was going through a really horrible recession. There was a ton of sort of abandonment and disinvestment in the central part of the city. And so I think it's important to remember that it hasn't always been the way that it is now, and yeah.
I mean, I'll add on to that just to provide a little more context too, because that's of course when the majority of a lot of the gay folks who are living down in Pioneer Square move up to and have the opportunity to move up to the Hill. But it's also an opportunity for a lot of the Black community to move a little bit further up as well. And that had been happening before some of the exiting. And so I think keeping in mind too that what creates undesirability in a community seemingly was Blackness, right? Was the move to Bellevue for a lot of folks came at the same time that busing legislation came through, and that the move of the money out of Capitol Hill was a racial decision. And so I think thinking about desirability and lack of desirability is really important when we're thinking about space.
So sort of to continue on that, how do different folks experience space on Capitol Hill?
I think this is a really important question that I don't have the full answer to, but I think it's one that we need to actually ask. I do walking tours with different groups of my kids, and a lot of my kids are very class privileged, many of them race privileged, gender, sexuality privileged, and for them, they get to walk through a world that for the most part feels very welcoming to them. And that means they make a lot of assumptions about the spaces, including the school that they go to. About how welcoming it is to everybody else. And so I think it's a really challenging question when we're thinking about what is desirable about Capitol Hill and who it's desirable to, and particularly when we're thinking about development and who certain types of development are desirable to. And so I'm thinking about the fact that for myself, growing up poor in San Antonio, as a brown woman, there's a lot of spaces here that don't feel all that welcoming to me. That, hanging out in A. Rachel's Ginger Beer across the street from the 12th Avenue Police Precinct isn't exactly my idea of desirability. And those are elements of Capitol Hill that have been brought in as a part of development.
Yeah, I'd agree that Capitol Hill has a lot of spaces that feel like they're in transition and also under contention. Just speaking from personal experience, coming to the Hill was almost like a coming of age experience where, I would come to here and experience the arts community. There were venues where my band could play or my friends could perform. And now, I pretty much avoid coming here on the weekends, honestly, and it feels very different. Even as a woman walking down Pike Pine on a Saturday night, kind of feels like a meat gauntlet. It's no secret there's been, an increase in hate incidents and gay bashing, and there's been a revival of the Q Patrol, things that have arisen out of necessity to respond to this new reality. And the marketing of the neighborhood as being a desirable place, what always kind of begs the question, who is that geared towards? We can have rainbow crosswalks out on the street, but if it's not, a safe or safe-ish or welcoming place for queer folks anymore, then it's kind of just window dressing.
I think you both bring up good points because your question was about race. But for me, there's a big intersectionality because, right, I'm queer and I'm Black. It's like double whammy. So there are some spaces where they've thrown a rainbow flag in the window and they have Black Lives Matter poster. And I think to myself, wow, this is great. And then go in there and they're completely rude. Don't acknowledge me. Just completely, I'm thinking like, did you forget about the posters that you put in the window, or did you think that was going to draw more attention? And if so, what kind of attention did you want? Because you didn't want my attention based on the way you're treating me. So, and then I've been some places where I just shake my head and I think, there's no way I'm going in there. Like, I already know. And I go in there and it's completely not what I expected. And I've had some really good conversations and foundational support that I just didn't expect would occur. So I've experienced both. Also, I see many flyers and advertisements with people of color, but the actual establishments and the customers are not people of color. So I feel like there's a bit of imposter syndrome. You are displaying that you are open and you are telling me about all the diversity training you've gone to, and you are making me think it could be potentially safe. But when I look at how your business is run, when I look at your clientele, when I look at how you're discussing race or not, it's a completely different story. It doesn't quite match. And also, when I look at the people that live on the Hill, there's not a lot of POC artists from my point of view that live on the Hill. There's a lot of artists, but when I think about the ratio of the large amount of artists and how many of those artists are POC and just what is affordable to who, then I get hopeful and then I feel sad because I think there's still, in some spaces, there's still a disparity in what is projected or the goal and what is actually happening in real time. That has been my experience.
Awesome, thank you.
I also think that when we talk about Capitol Hill, there's actually many Capitol Hills, and Capitol Hills that are kind of moving in different directions and thinking about the history of race on Capitol Hill. We have parts of the neighborhood in the eastern part that were some of the only places in the city that didn't have racially restricted covenants, restricting Black folks and other folks of color from living in those homes. And then we have other parts of Capitol Hill which were some of the few parts of the city where white folks actively organized to get each other to all put in place racially restrictive covenants as this way of keeping folks of color out of those parts of the neighborhood. And I think that you see sort of that pattern replicated today in a certain way, and where you have the sort of Powhat part of Capitol Hill, the area between here and Olive and Broadway, which also historically has been a lower income part of the neighborhood, has had a lot of single room occupancy hotels that were more affordable to folks. You see a lot of those buildings getting redeveloped, those folks getting pushed out. At the same time, you're starting to see on the north end of the neighborhood where all the mansions are, things that are not mansions being built there for the first time. So that neighborhood is kind of transitioning in the other direction. And that's, more of a income dynamic than a race dynamic, what's happening currently today. But I think it's interesting to see. And then you also have sort of the nightlife district and sort of the different transitions that are happening with sort of businesses and who's coming to the neighborhood.
If I could just answer or offer one example of a sign that I posted on my Vanishing Seattle account that was reposted from a local artist, John Criscatello, who I'm a big fan of, but it's a sign that is posted at Pony, which is a gay bar in Madison, and it's a hot pink sign, and it says, "Attention, this is a gay bar, a very gay bar. If you aren't queer or a respectful ally, please leave. P.S. This isn't a zoo, and we're not your pets." And I think that is a very kind of powerful and stark example of ways that folks are claiming and reclaiming space that sometimes, in some ways, feel like is being compromised.
Yeah, and I think, I'm really grateful that Pony is still here. I think it's still, a sort of amazing, beautiful gem that I don't know too much about the past, but I feel like it hasn't changed much. But in the slideshow that we had up earlier, there were some other spaces that no longer are here. Like Vogue was one of them. Man Ray, I believe, was another one. I was curious, because you run Vanishing Seattle, what does it mean to, and anyone can answer afterward, but what does it mean to preserve heritage?
That's a big one. I think there's so many ways to go about it. There's, methods that you can approach it with, whether that's storytelling or poetry, documentation. I think it's necessary that there's an intergenerational component and that there's a continuity, and we see how gentrification and displacement can kind of disrupt that continuity of place and of narrative. I think a lot of times the conversation that happens now in the city around preservation can be a little bit narrowly focused, in that it just kind of talks about buildings and, let's just keep old buildings as they are, and it's opposed to, or it's a false dichotomy between saving an old building and progress or development. And there's a lot of examples where you'll see preservation of buildings that have sustained spaces, culturally important spaces that help ensure the survival and the thriving of communities. Washington Hall is one example that comes to mind. Obviously it's not just about buildings. I think ultimately it's about cultural and community preservation, and for communities to be able to have sovereignty and self-determination around what that looks like, and to have ownership over their own, not only the telling of their own history, but also what the future looks like.
Awesome. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'm a teacher too, and so I guess I'm wanting my teacher family to step up a little bit when you're taking your kids on field trips and you're doing all this. You're talking about the history. That's the time to say, and before this group of people lived here, and they did these things, and actually you're standing upon XYZ. I think teachers and professors and docents need to be more aware of the history so that they can retell the history. I think also just a pure acknowledgement, people acknowledging like, wow, I'm stepping in on another person's territory or another group's whole history. at least let me acknowledge this isn't my land. I'm actually borrowing it, or I want to live here peacefully, or I think there is a level of privilege that doesn't even acknowledge what is happening. And I don't think that acknowledgement takes away everything, but I think definitely acknowledgement is a start to acknowledgement and storytelling.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so back to Cynthia. Just curious. So, Vanishing Seattle, a lot of followers here in this room. But there are over 28,000 followers across your social media channels. So I'm curious, why did you start the project, and why does it resonate with so many people?
Yeah, so I started Vanishing Seattle in early 2016, and it was really just out of a personal need and urge to document and take pictures of all these places that were disappearing around me. And, honestly, this process is nothing new. I mean, Seattle has been burning down longhouses and displacing people, since 1861 or whatever. And I think there's some parallels in those processes that are very much a legacy of displacement of First Peoples from this area and of that cultural genocide. So, what I capture is, just a kind of a snapshot. But I didn't really expect or plan or have this, grand intention that it was going to pick up so much. And people will send me a lot of stuff too. So, and I, really appreciate and encourage that, because I think the thing that makes it more compelling is that it's community storytelling, where folks can share the places that are meaningful to them. So, it's been a couple years, and I'm still kind of experimenting with it, and learning from it. I think the most exciting thing for me is there ways that it can encourage and facilitate folks to get more engaged and involved, or to build community, whether that's online or offline or connecting the two. But I think it resonates folks because people are feeling it, they're living through it. And it's really, all around us, and I think there's not a person in the city who isn't impacted by it in some way.
Awesome, thanks. I think, one thing that when Brad and I were first talking about this event was sort of before this neighborhood that we see now, the queer, the artistic neighborhood, what was here before that? Who was here before that? And then we just kept going. We're like, well, who was here before that? And wait, who was here before that? But just saying, could we go all the way back, sort of to, as far back as we can go? And so I feel like the same thing goes with sort of the conversation around power, the conversation about why is this happening? This isn't a new issue. So I wanted to direct the next question to Marianne. What are some of the root causes of gentrification that we can organize around right now? And are there examples from the past that can provide guidance?
I think the simple answer is capitalism and racism. But to take us back a little bit here, this is native land. And very quickly, the white settlers who came here in 1861 did as much as they could to push out and exterminate as much of the native population as they felt was unneeded, use the rest to build the city, physically build the city, and then marginalize them in what we know of as sort of the Elliott Bay area where the stadiums are now. And that has traditionally been and was all the way through the Great Depression, basically an area called Shacktown, Hooverville, whatever you want to call it, just a massive homeless encampment. Ultimately not homeless encampment because people got together and built their own homes. But so something I think that's really important in the history of Seattle and understanding is that our understanding of the homeless crisis and these sweeps as something new is not new. The Seattle's been, quote unquote, solving its housing crisis by burning down poor people's houses for over 100 years at this point. And those people have been responding with virulent resistance to that and organization. And so the basically marshes that were this sort of garbage area of town. They literally filled in the area with garbage to extend the land of Seattle down in Elliott Bay. Was this very multiracial place. It was, again, where the last of sort of the native population at the time was hanging on in the city lived. There were poor Anglo settlers, lots of people who were, seasonal workers working in lumber. And it was where a decent amount of the city's Asian population as well lived. And I think something that's important to remember is that basically the germ of the general strike, which happened in 1919 in Seattle, which was a working class takeover of the city, came out of that area. I think why that's an important lesson for us today is the arguments that they were making at that time are the same arguments that houseless folks are making today, which is that they had a right to a city, they had a right to space in the city, they had a right to a home. I think that's important because not enough of our conversations around housing are around the idea that housing is a right, not a privilege, but a right, and that housing in an area, in a space that allows you access to the services you need is really important. And just to push us forward several decades, I think a story on Capitol Hill that's really important for us to understand is sort of what happens after that initial push of some of the queer community onto the Hill. I think it's really important that we understand that Capitol Hill has mostly always been a white, gay, cis neighborhood. It's not a place that a mass amount of folks of color have ever really been welcomed into. And while there were radical coalitions led by people of color at the time that were doing work on Capitol Hill, some of whom lived on the Hill, ultimately, there was kind of two paths and a road not taken. And the road that was taken by the dominant folks in power, which was gay cis business owners, was development. And the development of the Broadway Business District. And when we're talking about gentrification now, and we're talking about direct roots of that, we can look directly to the relations between the Greater Seattle Business Association, municipal authorities, and heterosexual business owners, and the sort of coalition they formed that ultimately put the needs of development and the desirability of the neighborhood ahead of social justice issues, ahead of racial justice, ahead of gender justice. And so I think those are some really important stories that we should remember when we're thinking about where things came from.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, when you mentioned burning poor people's houses down, I kind of immediately thought of being priced out, or you can't burn people's houses down as easily, but you can increase the rent. Or even just buy somebody's property. But yeah, I think about that in terms of for people who can be pushed out by force easily through their landlords or through developers. I wanted to bring it back to Capitol Housing. So in many ways, it's a success story for bringing affordable housing. But looking back, from your perspective, why is it that gentrification, homelessness, and a lack of low-income housing, why are those persistent problems? I know we sort of covered that, but I'm just curious from sort of your line of work.
I think the first big thing to acknowledge is that we're the scale of what we're able to do in terms of providing housing for people is not meeting the scale of the need, and not even close. So it's great to have 88 affordable apartments in 12th Avenue North, for example, and we have another couple dozen buildings around the neighborhood, but it's small, and it can feel like a drop in the bucket when you see folks sleeping in doorways and talk to your friends about having to move further and further away from their jobs and from their community. So I think that's a big thing to acknowledge, and I think one of the things that we're trying to figure out how to do better is how do we build the buildings that we're building, but also partner with broader movements to affect affordability citywide and region-wide, because we know that those particular projects aren't going to be enough on their own. So that's, I mean, I think that's sort of the direction that we're trying to take in bringing those things together. We've been working with a group of renters in the neighborhood called the Capitol Hill Renter Initiative. I think there's like at least one person from the Renter Initiative here tonight. We did some work together last year on supporting different tenant protections that the City Council passed, which I think was a really important step, and are doing work around other regulations. I mean, one of the things that we talked about when you first approached me about this event was that it was the same night and the same time as the hearing for our neighborhood on the mandatory housing affordability program. So it's sort of like one of the biggest sort of policies that the city is currently proposing to address affordability, and participating in those conversations, influencing how that policy is shaped, I think is an important way to be involved. There are these really big systems, and you already touched on a lot of the history. Two other things that I would call out, I think. The series of federal housing policies after World War II that basically put all of this investment in the suburbs and created this opportunity for white folks primarily to move to the suburbs, acquire homes with a federally subsidized mortgage at a really discounted rate, homes that were being bought at very low prices at that time, that other folks were completely shut out of. And so then when those homes eventually became much more valuable because all this investment in highways and putting in all the other infrastructure to make all these new suburbs possible was done, then the sort of ownership of those homes was kind of locked in for white folks. And you still see, I mean, I think that's one of like the big big reasons for the gap, the racial gap in wealth that we see now, and then you have the situation where I feel like the idea of buying a house in Seattle seems impossible, but I come from a family that has my parents own a house in Seattle, so for folks that are coming without any kind of family wealth to that situation, it's completely different. And then the other thing I think to think about is, so you had this federal policy and all these other policies that were really pushing the investment and pushing resources to the suburbs. And then, about 20, 30 years ago, you start to see this reverse, right, where people with power and money and privilege realize, well, I don't actually want to have to drive for 2 hours to get to my job. I don't want to be in a place where I can't walk to a store. I want to be close to things. Actually, those central neighborhoods like Capitol Hill are really nice. And you start to see this set of policies and structures be put in place to sort of return investment and, like you were talking about, investment in resources to those places. And so you see kind of this inversion now of low-income folks of color being pushed out of the center of the city, which is now perceived as desirable, and white folks with money coming in. Though I think it is a really important point that a lot of Capitol Hill actually was very organized in being one of those neighborhoods that was continued to be an exclusive sort of white enclave in the center of the city. And I'm talking for too long, but there was one other point that I felt like I wanted to make. And then I think the other thing that we have to talk about unavoidably in the sort of really recent term is Amazon. Right? I mean, I think having 40,000 really high-paying jobs located right next door is just sort of an enormous shock to the system, right? And we don't know how to respond to that effectively at the pace that change has been happening.
Anyone else can answer, but what are some of the other forces like Amazon that are shaping or empowering gentrification or fueling gentrification in Capitol Hill? I think Amazon is enough. So I think something too that I was really interested in sort of learning. I see the sort of the land use signs that let you know this is what's going to take place on this site. They get tagged up, they get defaced, and I think there's sort of there's a feeling of anger, or almost like a feeling that it's too late to get involved. So I'm personally trying to understand too, what does the development process look like, and for people or residents who are interested, how do we get involved as early as possible versus just reacting to it?
Well, I'm no land use expert, and I think we saw from the show of hands at the beginning that there's like 2 people here who feel that they are, and I think that kind of is part of the problem, is that there's a lack of transparency, accessibility to know what the points of intervention are, or just how people can feel some ownership or control about what's happening in their community. And I'm still learning about the process too. I think those land use signs are a great place to express like real public comment, because there's a sense that well, I'll give an example. I partnered with an architecture firm for Design Fest over the summer, and they did this installation called Did You Notice? And it was about the design review process. And I asked folks to indicate through the interactive installation how many people have noticed one of those proposed land use action signs. And almost everyone said yeah, and they have read it. And then the next question was, have you gone to one of those design review meetings? And much less number of people said yes. And then of the people who had gone to a meeting or had engaged in the process somehow, submitted a public comment, how many people felt that they were listened to, or what they said mattered? And it was like very, very little. So I think there's a systemic issue in that. I mean, there's some things that there's like what's it called? Land use information bulletin. If you have like tons of hours in the day, you could monitor that. There's Seattle in Progress. There's Shaping Seattle. I mean, basically it's like, it could be, you could try and monitor and organize around one site or one project, and it could be like, a full-time job. So I think the larger question is like, what do we do to change the conditions that have enabled this inequitable development that we're seeing all around us? I think, organizing is a big part of it. And there's a lot of great groups that are doing that. I mean, I would give a shout out to CID Coalition, Humbles Not Hotels for one. Got Green is doing a lot of great work on Beacon Hill on the south end. Artist Coalition for Equitable Development, or ACE, is looking at cultural spaces specifically in equitable development around the CD. Capitol Hill Historical Society is doing some work here. Puget Sound Sage. But I mean, for me, like the big thing that I'm learning is that, again, capitalism is a huge problem, and housing and land has become a commodity. And so, housing is a speculative thing. So there are examples where people have organized to get more community ownership, community control of land, and get that out of the speculative market. So I think like for a long range vision, that's one way is to make sure that, our lives and our spaces are not just vulnerable to going to the highest bidder.
Yeah, when you were speaking, it was reminding me of I'm a graphic designer, so I noticed the land use signs have been redesigned. I was like, oh, the typography is better. I can definitely read it. But it's just like going back to the Black Lives Matter signs and the, seeing people of color in advertisements and the rainbow flags. It's like, it's just on the surface. And we just gave it a new facelift. But everything behind it and the whole process that you don't see all the way down to the roots are rotten. So it really made me think about that. It's like, how can we not just try to address things at the very last point and react to that, but try to get to the core of the problems? So I'm curious if any of you have seen some really innovative solutions around or ways to approach affordable housing, or sort of new ways to kind of work within the system, some sort of short-term or temporary solutions?
I don't know if this is actually quite the right answer to that question, but I think one of the things that that I see people starting to look at right now that I think is a really important piece of the puzzle is we've created a system where we're restricting all of the new development and growth in our city into a very tiny fraction of the city, and that's a big sort of underlying cause of, I think, a lot of why we get the kind of development impacts that we get. And so I'm starting to see people organizing and going to sort of the 65% of our city that's sort of exclusive single-family zoned areas where those houses are becoming, worth $1 million or more in many cases, and starting to organize and say, we need to have affordable housing here. The campaign around doing affordable housing in Fort Lawton in Magnolia, I think, is one of the sort of the most prominent of those examples. And I think that seeing that campaign, seeing a lot of people who maybe don't always agree with each other on solutions for these problems come together around that campaign was something that I thought was really exciting.
I think on a smaller scale, this kind of thing, I've been seeing more of people being brave enough to have the conversation. Like I said, acknowledgement. Let's talk about race. Let's talk about gentrification. Well, what's going on in your neighborhood? Well, this is what's going on in my neighborhood. I've seen a lot more willingness for people to actually get together and talk about things that before we were just like, of course that's not going on. Would you like some more tea? And that doesn't cause change automatically, but I do believe it does start to at least make some ripple effects.
For me, I take a lot of inspiration looking at some of our own local history. For example, the Gang of Four. For folks who might not know who that was made up of, it was Uncle Bob Santos, Robert Santos, Bernie Whitebear, Roberto Maestas, and Larry Gossett. And a lot of spaces that are existing today, it's because they took really bold action and they occupied spaces that are now the Northwest African American Museum, Daybreak Star, we have El Centro de la Raza. So, I mean, I think we've done it before, and I think we're in a pretty, crisis situation here. So I think that we have that, within our community and our own history, to take those type of actions. And shout out to No New Youth Jail, too, for those type of bold public, interventions.
Yeah, thank you for bringing up No New Youth Jail. I wanted to bring that up for the specific purpose of I don't think there is a short-term answer. And I think going back to why this persists, I think one of the number one reasons is that as a nation, as a city, we've not reckoned fully with our massively awful history of racism, and that I don't think issues in housing and equity will be fixed without that. I think the fact that there continue to be deep-rooted ties to property values and the class and race of the people that live in a given neighborhood means that it's going to be very hard to get folks who do own their own spaces to be open to mixed neighborhoods in any sort of real way that actually feels equitable and actually feels welcoming and feels like a community. And the thing I want to challenge too at a certain point is over-sentimentality, something which I feel like I have very little of, that rather than looking backwards for the answer, I think we have to look to the future. And in that sense, I think what the youth are doing with No New Youth Jail is offering more than simply a reform solution to a problem, but instead imagining futures where there is not incarceration, where there are not prisons, where there's not policing in the way we see it now. And I think that's what we need more of, is more of that imagination. And I think that means more from privileged folks and more from those of us who are older, and actually following behind, not from afar, but right behind youth who I think are leading the way with really great ideas.
And so some of us, I think, feel that it might be too late, or we're in sort of late capitalism, and too much has happened. It's too little, too late. So I think for all of us here who do want to get involved, who are interested, and this is a question for all of you, what power do we have to change this?
I'd say all the power in the world. As workers, we build everything. But I think I just wanted to come back to something, Anastasia, that you'd said while you were reading, that we aren't a community because we don't speak the same language. And I think again and again and again, it's because people in power and privilege are demanding that marginalized folks speak their language, and that a lot of us with some power and some privilege demand that too, instead of realizing that we do need to speak the same language, and that's the language of marginalized folks, particularly queer, POC, Black trans women.
I think I'm choosing my words carefully. I think it would help if people already in power, or who have some level of power or some level of privilege, who claim to be allies and who say all the time how they want to support and help and what can I do, I want to do better, be better, is to say, oh, now might be the time. This might be the time that I actually figure out what I can do. I have just been calling out to all of those people. Where are you? I'm not saying people aren't doing that, but there are still quite a few people that I think are saying that to me often. What can I do? Things are so bad. Did you see the news? I don't know. And I'm thinking, wow, you have a lot of power and you have a lot of privilege. So I think my question is, what are you going to do? How are you going to help change the community? What are you going to do when you go to the meeting? So that's I think I just want to throw the question back out to the universe and to the people. Those of you in different positions of power and privilege and visibility, what are you going to do? How can you help?
Awesome. Anybody else? What power do we have to change this? Folks in the audience.
Yeah, I believe that we all have our own personal power and agency, even if it comes down to the daily choices that we make, and how we're acting out of our own set of values. Even if it's something as simple as, where do you choose to shop? Are you supporting small businesses and the things that you love about your community? How are you supporting the local ecosystem? Are you, choosing something other than, convenience and consumption all the time? I know it's hard to do, but I think a lot of times, nowadays we equate convenience with progress. Also, I would say just to keep talking about your experience and your story, and talking about, the issues that we're facing as a community. Sometimes I come across folks that are like, oh, you talk about this all the time, blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it's not, because I, love it. It's not like it's fun for me to, go around and take pictures of and, feel all the feels about all these places that are disappearing. But I can't get away from it. It's important. It's not like I really have a choice. And so many other people, have been displaced already, and, they didn't have much of a choice either. So I think as long as we keep talking about it and talking to our peers and our neighbors, say hi to your neighbors, and just keep, telling your story, I think that's very powerful, and that, eventually can help change the narrative that I think enables, again, a lot of this, inequitable development and displacement to happen.
Alex, you want to answer, or should we go to Q&A?
I mean, I liked we have all the power in the world. I think that kind of sums it up for me.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for being part of the panel. We're going to open it up to the audience. We got about 15 minutes. If you have any questions or maybe something you'd like to ask to one of the panelists, come on up to the microphone, just one question per person. Feel free to ask whatever you'd like. Can we get a round of applause for the panelists, please? Well, any questions? Short questions? Thanks.
So I like to think about collective liberation a lot, and I was wondering, 5 minutes or something for an answer, or how much time do we have left?
We've got about 10 minutes for the rest of the event.
Okay, I was wondering, there's all this history, all this information, and all this stuff to process, and I always like to think of the path from here to collective liberation. And so if you could kind of envision a path from here to that, what does that look like to you, and how do we think of all these systems together towards all new systems that work better? So just to wrap that up, what's your vision personally from here to collective liberation? Big question, but it's my favorite one.
I think I have to be honest. For me, for the way my brain and heart and mind and spirit works, and thank you, you've asked an enormous question. So my answer is that I've been thinking about collective liberation too. Maybe I don't use those same terms, but I've been thinking about how do I draw the strength from my ancestors and my orishas, and my heart and my spirit and my intellectual self and my creative self, and my activist self, and how do I sort of like join forces with all those parts of me and other people's selves, and what would that look like if we all had a similar, I don't know, social justice vibration or collective thought? So I can't answer your question, but I do want to tell you that I've been thinking about what that might look like too, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's interesting to imagine something that you've never felt or seen, to be inside a system that is so embedded into everyday life that it's like a fish trying to imagine what it's like to be outside of water. And I think, it's a beautiful thing to think about. Anybody else have a question for the panel? All right. Last comments?
I'll just speak to that.
Sure.
I think as a historian, as a history nerd, I draw a lot of sort of influence and inspiration from the past. And I draw that both on sort of a personal identity level from Chicana struggles and the ones that I remember learning about that happened in my own city in San Antonio, which growing up in felt like a very conservative and very scared place, in a sort of ever-growing Border Patrol militarization era. And I think on a larger level, drawing inspiration from those moments when it seems that folks have overcome their differences. And so I think, again, for me, the most inspiring things I've seen in the history, at least of the United States, I think the Civil War is one of them, which is normally a very boring historical story. But when we actually look into it and realize that this was a moment when not only 4 million Black folks threw off chains, but also at least some amount of the white population actually saw it as their duty to help fight for that as well, and ultimately demand that the United States, which had no interest in equality or citizenship for Black folks, make that a priority. I think that's a huge moment. And thinking about how that came to be, what it meant for white folks to get over their racism to the point of actually taking action, and then also, unfortunately, looking at the devastating legacy of what happens in Reconstruction when they give up that cause. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned in that stuff. And so, short answer then is, for me, I think collective liberation, especially in this country, has to start with racial justice and finding a way to actually come together and rally behind people of color, and fighting for racial justice. And to me, that's where everything else starts to line up behind it.
All right, well, if there's no other questions, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming out here tonight. I wanted to thank our poets, our presenter, our panelists. Yeah, this event was even more than I could have ever imagined, so thank you all so much. Thank you all for being here, and hope to see you at some future town hall events.